This is Dr. S. the Legend. He's back. I'm going to talk about two things today in our conversation. First, I want to talk about the Letitia James indictment, and then I'm going to get into the major part, which is the peace settlement in Gaza. So, Letitia James, Attorney General of New York State, has been indicted for mortgage fraud by a Virginia grand jury. The indictment claims that she obtained a mortgage for a property that she claimed was her principal residence. The only problem was she has another principal residence in New York State. You can't have more than one principal residence. For mortgage purposes, your primary resident, you only get one primary residence, and you get a good mortgage rate for that. If you have more than one home, vacation home or otherwise, the second mortgage rate is going to be higher than the first mortgage rate. So to make a long story short, she was accused of lying on her mortgage application in Virginia for the second property, where she looks like she rented out. So that's the indictment for Letitia James. Now, some have accused the indictment as being revenge on the part of the Justice Department and Donald Trump. Now, you have to understand that Donald Trump was also indicted for mortgage fraud, and she was the Attorney General in New York. Didn't indict him. He wasn't indicted for mortgage fraud. It was a civil case. So no one's above the law. Now, you have to understand here that if you are an attorney, or more importantly, you're an attorney general in a state, you're at a higher standard than the average person because you should know better. As an attorney, I know this. So this was probably not just an inadvertent mistake. And a defense by some is that, well, thousands of people do this, so it's no big deal. Well, the problem is thousands of people do this and they get indicted because it's a federal crime. So you can't have it both ways. If Donald Trump was being charged for mortgage fraud, then it should be equally applied to Letitia James. Anyway, it's possible that she may get off, depends on the judge, she may get off and argue malicious prosecution on part of Donald Trump's Justice Department. However, even if that happens, one would think it would go to trial, but if that doesn't happen, then she's in a situation where she still has to worry about the New York State Bar Association and whether or not she has engaged in unethical conduct. And she could be suspended, or she could be disbarred, or ever. Now, you have to remember that the case she lodged against Donald Trump is mostly over. The appeals court in New York State threw out the fine of somewhere in the nature of $500 million because it was a violation of the Eighth Amendment. Now, the whole case is on appeal to the highest court in New York State because there's still the issue of the injunction that applies to Donald Trump and his sons. So it remains to be seen what the highest court in New York is going to do. Worst comes to worst, Donald Trump can still appeal that case to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court has already ruled back in 2019 that under the Constitution and the Eighth Amendment, there shall be no excessive fines. And they ruled in 2019 9-0. Liberals and conservatives ruled together, and Judge Ginsburg wrote the opinion and said in that case that even a $40,000 fine was excessive. In Donald Trump's situation, we're talking about almost a $500 million fine. When all is said and done, once this case gets fully thrown out, which is I'm the opinion it will, we're talking about Donald Trump's case, he could then turn around and sue Letitia James and the state of New York for malicious prosecution. And then the whole issue will be where he can sue, whether he can sue in Florida, whether he's going to sue in New York, and it remains to be seen what'll happen. However, the problem for Letitia James is her interests are different than the state of New York, if he names both of them as defendants. So one would argue, regardless of what happens to her, the process will be the punishment. All right, let me move on to the more important things, is that there is seemingly a peace treaty or a peace agreement in Gaza. And by peace, we mean the absence of war. It's interesting, all of a sudden, we don't hear anything about genocide in Gaza. There was no genocide. This is a pseudo term. But everyone's silent. No one's talking genocide. It looks like Donald Trump silenced all the genocide people. And most of them were European governments in Northern and Western Europe. I still don't understand why governments in Europe 2,000 to 3,000 miles away from Gaza are obsessed with the war in Gaza. I don't understand that. In any case, there are a number of countries that I personally consider as, in the war in Gaza, as anti-Israel and even so much as anti-Jewish. And let me go through them very, very quickly. Mention the worst of the worst. That would be Spain. Their Prime Minister, Mr. Pedro, that's his first name. I call him Torquemada. Pro-Hamas, I consider. And the second worst is Slovenia. And their Prime Minister, he's named Mr. Blob. That's his real name. I don't understand their positions, but they're seemingly the worst of the worst, anti-Israel, and both these countries have a long history of being anti-Jewish. And many have equated being anti-Israel as being anti-Jewish. Some of the other countries that are negative, pro-Hamas or pro-Palestinian, United Kingdom, France, Ireland, Sweden, Portugal, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway. The only two countries that have any kind of Jewish population is the United Kingdom and France. So I would advise, if you're Israeli or Jewish, avoid these countries. You have nothing to gain from being in there. If you live there, it might be time to get out. Now, this is the governmental policy of these countries, and not necessarily the policy of the people in the country. Maybe things can change, but I don't know. Now, what's never mentioned is there's a whole bunch of other countries in Europe that are pro-Israel and remain pro-Israel to a large extent. And quickly I'll mention them. Italy, Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Serbia, Croatia, Albania, North Macedonia, and I'm leaving out Bosnia because it depends on the population there, and I'm leaving out Russia because, well, they play both sides against the middle, Mr. Putin. So we're talking about, well, the general term, peace in the Middle East. And that's a bit of a oxymoron because you generally you haven't had it in history. So I hope President Trump succeeds in his plans for Gaza, but I remain skeptical due to the history and the present situation and what has taken place. Again, I hope he succeeds, but I'm skeptical. So let me give a little bit of history and mention and make it absolutely clear that there's always been a Jewish presence in the Holy Land going back thousands of years. That's very important to understand because some people have questioned it. And we're talking about terms, the Holy Land, Israel, Judea, the Old Testament, the Hebrew tribe. So we can go back to the first Jewish-Roman war, starting in the year 66. The Romans won. They destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. This was around the time of Jesus. Then there was a second revolt by the Hebrews, the Bar Kokhba revolt, in year 132. The Romans basically depopulated the Holy Land. They leveled Jerusalem. And the most important part is Emperor Hadrian renamed the area. He called it Palestina, which referred to the land of the Philistines, an historical enemy of the Hebrews. He was sticking it to the Hebrews or the Jews by renaming the area. So it's really not Palestine, it's Palestina. Even with all the expulsions by the emperor, there remained a Jewish center in the area of Galilee. So there's always been a Jewish presence there. In the Roman period, there were over 1 million people there. But by the 14th century, when the Ottoman Turks conquered the area, the population had been diminished to around 300,000. And the area, as we call the Holy Land, was basically a backwater. Briefly, I say briefly, there was the Kingdom of Jerusalem by the Crusaders from 1099 to 1291. They reconquered the Holy Land for the Christians. And there's always been in the Old City, 4 quarters: the Muslim quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Christian quarter, and the Armenian quarter, which still exists today. So let me fast forward to the present. So we got the Ottoman Turks, and the Ottoman Turks were involved in World War I, and the British fought the Ottoman Turks, and the British defeated them in World War I. General Allenby took control of what's called the Holy Land today. And at the conclusion of the war, the British took over what was then, they called it Palestine, or Mandatory Palestine, between years 1918 and 1948. And the British government took an official position. They declared something called the Balfour Declaration in November of 1917. They said that there should be a homeland, a Jewish state. This was the position of the British government in early as November of 1917. And they said that there should be a partition, meaning a Jewish state along with an Arab state. Now the Arabs didn't like this, so in 1936 they revolted against the British. And the British put down their revolt severely. And there was about 10% of the Arab population was either killed or wounded in this revolt. After World War II, the British decided to pull out and divide the Palestine or Palestine mandate into 2 parts. A Jewish part, Israel, and an Arab part. This was, and Israel declared its independence on May 14, 1948, and accepted into the UN. Now this was unacceptable to all of the Arab states. And they invaded Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Sudan. Unfortunately for the Arab states, the Israelis won. This is called the War of 1948. At the conclusion of the war, Jordan took the West Bank of the Jordan River, incorporated it into Jordan, and Egypt gained control of Gaza. Moving right along, in June of '67 there was a war. There's always a war. That's why I'm sort of skeptical. I hope the president succeeds, but there's been too many wars. So in June of '67 there was a war, and Israel captured Gaza and the West Bank. Gaza from Egypt and the West Bank from Jordan. And they also took the Golan Heights from Syria and now have incorporated into Israel. In 2005, Israel moved out of Gaza. And in 2007, there was an election in Gaza, and Hamas won the election. The only election ever in Gaza. Now, we still have the West Bank under the control of Israel. Sometimes it's called Judea and Samaria. Sometimes it's called the occupied territories. Regardless, Israel controls the West Bank. Now, let me talk briefly about the demographics of modern Israel. There are today about 10 million people in Israel. Approximately 79% of these individuals we could consider Jewish, and 21% Arab. They're called Arab Israelis. Within Israel, they almost rarely identify as Palestinians. They are divided into Sunni Muslims, Christians, Druze, and Bedouin. There are also, on the West Bank, 600,000 Israelis and about 2 million Muslims on the West Bank. And supposedly the West Bank is to be a Palestine or Palestine country. But how can there be a Palestine country in the West Bank where you have 600,000 Israelis? So in any case, let me mention something about the Arab population, the Arab Israelis. The Druze, for example, are fully incorporated into Israel. They serve in the Israeli military. There's about 150,000 Druze. There's about 250,000 Bedouin. And the Bedouin are descendants of Arab nomads. They live in southern Israel, and many of them volunteer to serve in the Israeli military. And a significant number of Bedouin were killed by Hamas during October 7th. So the Bedouin aren't very happy. And a number of Druze soldiers in the Israeli military were also killed. Again, there's the question of, let's recognize the country of Palestine. My comment is, where is Waldo? Where is this place? Certainly it ain't going to be Gaza today, because Gaza is a disaster. And you have problems with the West Bank. What do you do with the 600,000 Israelis already on the West Bank? So the peace in the Middle East, it's a bit of a contradiction in terms. Let me talk about Donald Trump's peace plan, phase 1. Phase 1. The hostages should be returned. By the time this video is posted, hopefully all the hostages will be returned. Hamas keeps 30 deceased Israeli bodies hostage. How's that possible? It remains to be seen whether the deceased will be returned. For that, Israel is supposed to release thousands of Palestinian prisoners. And the Israelis have pulled back under phase 1, and from an area where they occupy about 80 to 90% of Gaza, they will now occupy about 55% of Gaza. And then more food will come into Gaza, and some of the people from Gaza will be allowed to go to Egypt. I don't know why, but that's phase 1. The problem is phase 2 is unclear. Who knows if we'll ever get to phase 2? But the Israelis have made it clear that Hamas cannot be in Gaza now or forever. And the problem is, how do you get Hamas out of Gaza? Because the Israelis do not trust Hamas to operate in Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces will never leave Gaza if Hamas is in Gaza. They just won't leave. They have basically conquered Gaza, and they intend to stay there. I mean, this is what happens in war. And Donald Trump has talked about, rebuilding Gaza. I don't know who's going to do it, how long it's going to take, what role Donald Trump, he's only got a little more than 3 years left in office. And that's the big question. Now let me talk about the accomplishments of Israel, what's changed in the Middle East, which leads me to believe that possibly we can have peace. First of all, Iran has been neutralized. No nukes. This is on the part of Israel and the United States. Iran with nuclear weapons was totally unacceptable. So Iran has been neutralized. And Iran supplied not only Hamas, but also Hezbollah and also Syria. The Israelis have neutralized Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're no longer a threat. And the Israeli army occupies part of southern Lebanon to make sure that Hezbollah doesn't bring back their weapons. Syria is no longer in civil war. Their former dictator Assad, he's gone. And therefore, Iran can no longer supply weapons to Hezbollah or Hamas through Syria. And Israel is now occupying a small area of Syria to make sure there aren't any weapons coming in. And as we've seen, Hamas has been tremendously weakened. They're almost destroyed in Gaza. By the way, people don't understand this or realize this. Hamas had a lot of influence in the West Bank, and generally they've been neutralized on the West Bank. So the Israelis have been very, very successful up to date, and we have to see what the future holds. And again, where's Waldo? Where's this Palestine going to be when the countries of Western Europe that I've mentioned before, like France and the UK and Spain, Spain, the land of the Inquisition, nice people. Maybe they inherited it. At least their present prime minister, certainly he has. So, where is it going to be on the map? And you have the problem with peace and the issue of any Palestinian leader, are they ever going to recognize Israel? And so far they haven't. Because most of the Palestinians, either in Gaza or the West Bank, think Israel shouldn't exist. And so do a number of other countries. So I'm still in a quandary as to why these Western European countries are obsessed with Gaza. I think they're clueless. They don't understand the situation there. They don't understand the history that they've gone through. And maybe they should stick to the European problems and stay out of Gaza. And maybe Donald Trump will make this clear to them. I don't know whether he's going to make the mistake of including them. You have to understand that Israel holds Hamas responsible for the attack on October 7th, 2 years ago, where 1,200 people were killed. This is serious business in Israel. Not only that, they hold the civilian citizens of Gaza, they hold them as complicit for supporting Hamas and voting for Hamas because they elected him in 2007. Hamas brainwashed the civilian population in Gaza. And what do you do with the people that have been brainwashed? They haven't had any elections. They don't know democracy. Israel is a democracy. They allow their Arab population to vote and hold office and be successful economically. Hamas, on the other hand, as part of their main issues of their constitution, has been the total destruction of Israel. So how can you have peace with these people? They need to be deprogrammed. And I'm not quite sure if this is going to happen. Let me mention about deprogramming, because there's a historical component of this, and if you know your history, let's talk about World War II and the Nazis under Hitler coming to power in 1933. And by the end of World War II, obviously Germany was defeated. The German civilian population supported Hitler and the Nazis. They were brainwashed. And we knew when we ruled and we conquered Germany that the civilians were brainwashed. So our military ruled Germany from 1945 to 1955. We didn't trust the Germans to rule themselves because we had to deprogram them. It was called denazification. And we had to wait 10 years before we allowed them to participate in democracy and to be rid of any vestige of the Nazis. I know oh, by the way, we kept significant troops even after 1955. Into the 1970s and 80s, we had 250,000 troops in Germany. And I know people that served there. And quite often their attitude was that they couldn't trust the older people because they considered them to be somehow connected to the Nazis. Of course, nobody after World War II in Germany would admit that there had been a Nazi. We did the same thing with Japan. General MacArthur ruled Japan for 8 or 9 years as a dictator before we allowed the Japanese people to have a semblance of a democracy, because we considered them all to be brainwashed, just as brainwashed as the Japanese were, as the Germans were in World War II. So who's going to deprogram the civilians in Gaza? No one has discussed this. How can you create a Riviera in Gaza when you have civilians that haven't been deprogrammed? Nobody's mentioned this. Now, one way is to get rid of Hamas, to make sure they're gone, is to cut off all their money. I mean, they've been basically militarily defeated. But you got to make sure that other countries, particularly countries like Turkey and Qatar, don't send any money into Gaza that Hamas gets control of. And I think Donald Trump has realized this, and I think he has made conditions of U.S. aid to countries in the Middle East that you better not send any money into Gaza so that Hamas can get control of it. So I don't know how you're going to get rid of all of these Hamas people in Gaza, because how can you identify them? And this is very unclear. This is supposedly all determined by stage 2. Maybe Donald Trump can accomplish a stage 2. He certainly has accomplished stage 1. But let me make this perfectly clear. Up until this point, no Palestinian leader, or even the majority of their population in Gaza or the West Bank, has even remotely considered even recognizing the state of Israel. What they want is the Israelis somehow to be gone. And that's not happening, particularly from a military point of view. So I hope and pray that the situation can be reversed, but the problems are monumental. This is Dr. S. the Legend getting ready to sign off. I just want to mention that you see all my rodeo pictures back here. I like the rodeo. These paintings are available online by this particular artist that does the rodeo paintings. They're beautiful. If you like rodeos, you like western scenes, they can be found on the website. So don't hesitate to look to the website. Again, this is Dr. S. the Legend signing off.